Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to be starting Chapter 4, which is about the War for Independence or the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, whichever title you see best to call it. But we've been kind of building to this a little bit already. And at the end of the previous chapter, we were starting to get into some of the changes in policy and the changes in the relationship between the American colonists and the British government. And we're going to continue to build on that from here, seeing how this pattern continues, the discontent of the American colonists continues, and things start to progress more and more rapidly, leading the colonists into an active state of rebellion against the British government by 1776. So obviously a lot is going to happen and a lot is going to change in relatively a short amount of time, because we were going along through that colonial period, that salutary neglect, all of that, progressing along pretty steadily. And then suddenly French and Indian War breaks out in 1754. It officially concludes in 1763. And what I was saying at the end of chapter 3 was talking about how that just changes everything. It changes everything about the way that the British see their colonies, about that whole relationship. The massive amount of debt at the end of the French and Indian War is a big part of that, but also just the desire by Britain to get their colonies under greater control and to stop some of what they were seeing by that point as excessive smuggling and just a complete disregard for British authority and all of that. One of the things that we finished with at the end of chapter 3 was talk about the Sugar Act and how that was a tax on sugar, and how that, as well as the way the navigation acts were being enforced, it's partly that the colonists are angry about just the law itself, but it also has to do with the way that it was being enforced. We mentioned the vice admiralty courts in the previous chapter and how those were military courts that did not have a jury. And so some colonists were arguing at this point that the enforcement of those laws violated their right to a trial by jury, but also some of the other ways in which these laws are being enforced are problematic as well, and causing the colonists to rebel and become, well, not rebel yet, but causing them to be quite upset. So I want to go over, before we look at the next major law that's passed that does cause acts of much more open defiance in the colonies, just a little bit more about what else was kind of causing some anger to brew and causing some misunderstandings. In addition to using those vice admiralty courts to enforce things like the Sugar Act and the Navigation Acts, the British government also started employing the use of something called writs of assistance. And basically what writs of assistance were like general search warrants. In other words, search warrants that did not list a specific thing. Typically, a search warrant would have to be specific. We are looking for these items. And if authorities found illegal items or something that wasn't on that specific search warrant, they couldn't confiscate it and they couldn't, prosecute you for it. But the writs of assistance are basically a blanket, permission for the British authorities, which there are more of at this point, to basically search for anything that they want. So the colonists would regard this as illegal. They would regard this as illegal search and seizure of their property. So it's another thing that contributes to the disgruntledness amongst the colonists. We also have the passage of the Quartering Act in 1764, I believe. Remember, one of the things that's going to change in the wake of the French and Indian War is that there are going to be more troops present in the colonies. Now, this time we're not talking about troops just patrolling the streets of colonial cities and towns. We're mainly talking about troops along those frontier borders, but there are going to be more troops, and that's expensive. And so the Quartering Acts meant that the colonists were going to have to basically provide housing for those troops, quarters. Okay, this doesn't have to do with money. We're talking about quarters as in housing for British soldiers. Now, we're not yet to like knocking on people's doors and requisitioning the use of people's actual homes, although we'll eventually get to that. This is mainly talking about just erecting barracks, military barracks or military housing. And it essentially means that the colonies are going to be responsible for providing those, or at least paying for them. And so this is also something that has got a lot of colonists grumbling. They're not, taken to the streets yet, but this is something that certainly isn't helping the situation and further making some colonists rather concerned about the increasing presence of British authority and all these new requirements and things like that that are being placed upon them. Now, like I was saying, with the Sugar Act, you do have colonists that are angry about it, that say this isn't right, this isn't fair, you can't pass taxes on us to raise revenue and stuff like that. Most of that protesting was coming from colonial merchants, from people directly involved in trade, and that anger was more in the form of complaining, petitions, letters, some speeches to colonial legislatures, and continued smuggling. But was not in the form of, people just rioting and going crazy like that. And it was also not something that affected average everyday folks, as I was saying, really merchants and people that were directly involved in trade. But that's about to change. And that changes with the passage of the Stamp Act in 1765. So here is where we're going to see for the first time the colonists unite together, all of them from New England to the South, people that normally would not have been involved in this, involved in these protests, that may not have even noticed things like the Sugar Act, are suddenly going to be up in arms protesting British rule. And that starts with the Stamp Act in 1765. The Stamp Act, again, this is all about gaining funds to pay for the French and Indian War, and also to pay for the increased number of British troops that are now going to be in the colonies. The Stamp Act is essentially taxing papers. It requires an official stamp to be placed on official papers like newspapers, any kind of legal documents like a will or a bill of sale, or some other kind of, a mortgage or a property deed, or, loan paperwork or anything like that. But other things, that you read for recreational purposes, pamphlets, leaflets. There's not a whole lot of book publishing that happens in the colony, so most of that was done in the form of pamphlets and leaflets. Even things like playing cards are going to be subject to the Stamp Act. So it requires that this official stamp be placed on those documents, but that's just confirming that the tax has been paid. You're really taxing the papers. Things like this have been used in Britain before. This was not an unusual thing to them. And it was not an incredibly heavy tax. It was really considered to be quite light, but it is taxing something completely different, and it's just set up in a different way. The thing about the Stamp Act that makes it profoundly different from all of the laws before it is that this is what you would call a direct tax. In other words, this is not a tax on trade. Navigation Acts were taxes on trade. Sugar Act was a tax on trade. The Stamp Act is not. It is a tax that is directly on the people. It is something that people are going to see right in front of their face. They're going to see that stamp. It's far more visible, and it affects far more people. Whereas those previous taxes and regulations really only affected people that were directly involved in trade. The average everyday colonist probably did not notice those things. The prices or the extra taxes were just kind of absorbed into the overall price and not by a whole lot. This is something that people are definitely going to see. Even though it is a light tax, they will notice it, and they will see that stamp there. There's a visible, representation of that tax. That's really going to anger a lot of people. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what the British Parliament was thinking in passing this law. They thought a direct tax would be more fair. They say this is on everybody. That way we're not just taxing the merchants and the traders and the people that have always been taxed. Everybody's going to bear the brunt of this. And I'll also point out that this affected people in Britain as well. It was not solely on the colonists. This was not big news. This was not like, oh my gosh, we're going to pass the stamp tax. This was kind of seen as just regular run-of-the-mill business. And so the British are actually going to be quite surprised at how the colonists are going to react to this so badly. But since it is a direct tax, and now all of a sudden you're affecting everybody, this is why you will get such a difficult reaction out of the colonies. So they do not, much to the surprise of the British, the colonists do not just say, oh, well, guess we have to all pay our fair share. Let's all chip in and do our part. The colonists, of course, go nuts. This is where they kind of lose their minds for the first time about this, and they erupt into mass protest, not just in New England, not just amongst traders and merchants, but all over, all 13 colonies involved in some way, in some kind of protest. And again, people that would have never been involved in this before, and that probably won't be involved in it for a long time after, are going to be involved in this. And the colonists' whole reasoning, their justification, their backing what becomes kind of their mantra for the Stamp Act situation, as well as really for the entire revolutionary period, is this phrase, which I imagine a lot of you have heard before: no taxation without representation. This is why the colonists say this is wrong. This is their justification for why they're protesting, why they disagree, and why they think these laws are not fair. They say this is taxation without representation. And what they mean by that is that they, the colonists, are not represented in Parliament, because they, the colonists, do not elect one of their own to go sit in London in Parliament to speak for them and be their voice. They then argue that makes these taxes illegal because they didn't get a say-so in it. Remember that the colonists, this is what we've been talking about, or what I've been talking about, that the colonists believe very firmly in representative government. We have been talking so many times about these different institutions in the colonies and different reasons why they believe that representative government is important, and they believe in that value, and they believe that they as people have a right to have a say-so in it. And so when they feel like they're being taxed without their consent, they lose their minds. And so that is their legal basis for all of these protests. So let's take a look at how the colonists respond to this, because this is a mass response and a way in which we see the colonies really starting to organize, work together, and organize mass protests together. Several ways that they respond together to this Stamp Act. One is through what's called the Stamp Act Congress. This is very similar to the Albany Congress that we talked about at the end of chapter 3, where each colony is invited to send delegates to this meeting to talk about this problem, to confront this problem with the Stamp Act. This time we have 9 colonies participating. So 9 of them choose to send delegations to discuss what they're going to do about this problem. And the importance of that is the same as with the Albany Congress. I mentioned then that, the colonies didn't, and they still don't at this point, they don't organize together. They don't really work together. They don't behave like a country the way that we might think. They're all individual pieces. But that's going to start to happen more and more, that they will start kind of working together. We saw that first attempt at the Albany Congress. Then only 7 colonies participated. Well, here we are a handful of years later, and 9 of them are participating. So it's another step in that direction, another opportunities for the colonies to get experience with, and in many cases start to see the benefit of working together like this, of being organized politically like this. So it is all of this protest, as well as doing what it does in the way of protest, it also provides opportunities for the colonies to start working together. And we're going to start seeing that happen more and more. So we really look at the Stamp Act Congress as being super important because of that unity that it's bringing together. But the main way that the colonies respond to this Stamp Act, which they do in a unified way, so we're still talking about working together here, is they all participate in what we call the Stamp Act boycott. A boycott, of course, is when you don't do something or don't buy something or don't participate in something until you get whatever it is that you want. In this case, they boycott British goods. So the colonists are boycotting British goods, saying they are not going to purchase or use British goods as much as is possible until this hated Stamp Act is lifted. And this boycott, again, was a massive undertaking by all of the colonies all together to band together and not utilize British goods. They would have called these actually non-importation agreements. The word boycott actually had not been invented yet, so that's not what they would have called it. But by our definition, that is what it is. And keep in mind, because of the mercantilist system, more than a majority, nearly all of the kind of manufactured goods that the colonists use on a day-to-day basis are British goods. So this is a pretty darn big sacrifice that many of them are going to have to be making. This is a lot of stuff, a lot of regular everyday things that they are accustomed to that they are not going to be using. That's a lot of business that colonial merchants are going to be missing out on. But they see this as an effective way to force the British to listen to them, because the other side of that coin is that's potentially a lot of money that Britain will lose if the colonists don't buy things, and they're banking on that. Now, in addition to the colonial-wide boycott, we have other kinds of demonstrations and protests happening in the colonies as well. Some of them happening more sporadically, some of them more radical than others. Considered probably to be one of the most radical colonial protest groups, a group you probably have heard of called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty, while they are most active certainly in the New England colonies, the New England colonies are always going to be the most boisterous, the most defiant, and the most radical in their protests. There were groups of the Sons of Liberty all over the colonies, all the way, to as far south as Georgia. The Sons of Liberty were a much more radical protest group. They were some of the same people that might have been organizing boycotts and giving speeches and writing petitions. But these are also the folks that are taken to the streets. They are the ones that are holding rallies. They are tarring and feathering tax collectors. They are attacking or harassing tax collectors, or harassing or attacking colonists that aren't participating in the boycott and that kind of stuff. And we'll continue to see the Sons of Liberty be active. They will continue to protest. Later in this section, we'll see them. These are the ones that are involved in the Boston Tea Party and that kind of stuff. So think of them as the ones that are out there in the thick of it, doing stuff that was considered quite radical, certainly for the time, and even some of it now. In addition to the Sons of Liberty, there's also groups throughout all of the colonies, throughout the entire Revolutionary period, called the Daughters of Liberty. Obviously, the Daughters of Liberty would be colonial women who were participating in these protests. Perhaps not quite as much by being out in the street and tarring and feathering tax collectors, but the Daughters of Liberty would do things to help support the boycott. And this is like the first big boycott, and this is probably the biggest large scale, all 13 colonies participating together boycott that they will have, but there will continue to be smaller boycotts throughout the entire Revolutionary period. And the Daughters of Liberty would assist in those boycotts, sometimes by just making homemade versions of the goods that they were boycotting, like making their own tea or weaving their own cloth. Later, it will also be, gathering supplies and stuff like that once the fighting starts. But women find a way, even though their participation in politics, of course, is quite limited. Women, of course, find a way to participate and to be involved, even if they're not the ones, making important political decisions. They're involved in some sort of a way. Now, remember that the point of all of this was to get the British government, to get Parliament's attention, and to convince them to either give representation in Parliament or get rid of the Stamp Act. And the thing is that the boycott is quite successful. The colonists were banking on the idea that this would cost Britain a great deal of money, and they would be forced to listen to the colonists and forced to give in to their demands. And it did work. In about a year's time, sometime the following year, Parliament does repeal the Stamp Act because they were so shocked and worried about the kind of protests and the boycotts and things that they were experiencing. But at the exact same time, because this also further proves to the British authorities that the colonists are out of line, that the colonists need to be controlled, they need to be reined in. So while they see it fit to repeal the Stamp Act, the British government also wants to be careful not to send the message to the colonists that they can get away with this again. And they want to make sure they send the message to the colonists that, we're giving in to you this time, but we want you to know who the boss is. We want you to remember that we are the boss, that we are the boss of you, that we can and we will make laws for you. So at the exact same time that they repeal the Stamp Act, literally the exact same swoop of a pen, the British Parliament also passes a law called the Declaratory Act, which is kind of like a declaration. It's basically just they're making a statement. And what they say in this Declaratory Act is that they, as Parliament, did have the right and did have the power and the authority to govern the colonies or to legislate for them in any matter whatsoever, is actually what it says. So this, again, is kind of like telling the colonies, okay, you win this round, but don't be thinking that we're just going away. Don't think that, we don't buy into your argument about taxation without representation as part of it as well, as saying that we'll get rid of this one because we know you don't like it, but we do not agree with you or the colonists belief that Parliament has no authority over them, which is what colonists are ultimately trying to say. So you don't have any authority over this. This is Britain saying, yes, we do, and we'll come back and tax you as we please. Which that probably didn't would not have been very welcome by the colonists, but most of them actually kind of ignore it. They're too busy celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act. And at that point, once the Stamp Act is repealed for many colonists, it is back to business as usual. They have no further issue with the British government. They do not protest anymore. They go back to buying British things. We are all just one big happy family again. We had that little disagreement, but now we move on for that. And that's going to be the case for a lot of colonies for quite some time. They will not be kind of united again in protests like this for quite a while. From this point on, well, at least from this point for the next several years, the protests that do happen are going to be quite significant, but they're going to be increasingly concentrated in the New England colonies, and we will see why. About a year after the passage of, or excuse me, the repeal of the Stamp Act, Parliament comes back again with another law or set of laws called the Townshend Acts. And the Townshend Acts put taxes on a couple of different things. And this is still about paying debt, paying for colonial defense, all of that stuff, and just further asserting their authority over the colonies. The Townshend Acts put taxes on a handful of goods. Paper was taxed, paint, lead, glass, also tea. This is actually where the tax on tea comes from. A lot of people forget that. So duties on a lot of different things to kind of spread it around. And this was a tax on trade. So they're going back to taxing trade. It's not a direct tax the way that the Stamp Act was. The British Parliament seems at least to have learned their lesson about that from the whole Stamp Act debacle. The Townshend Acts, again, because they are taxes on trade, they really affect only those people that are directly involved in that, which this is why this stuff starts to concentrate more heavily on New England. And the protest and the negative reaction starts to come almost entirely from New England, because think about New England's economy. It was based in large part off of trade. That was a big part of their economy. Think about who the elite upper class is in New England. It's wealthy merchants. They are the ones who are being taxed in this. And those are the people that are educated. Those are the people that have the resources and the ability and the time even to get mad about it and to try to do something about it. Now, with the Townshend Acts, there is a significant reaction. It is just far more sporadic. It's not as unified as what we saw under the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, almost imagine that as all 13 colonies banded together to all do the same thing at the same time. This is a bit more piecemeal, meaning it's this city, that county, this colony. They're all kind of doing their own thing, although they all are responding. They are doing that with continued boycotts of British goods here and there, continued smuggling. We know that the British have been trying to crack down on smuggling, but they will never get that totally under control. And there's just overall anger and resentment, and all that tension just continues to increase and brood in those New England colonies. So there is definitely a reaction. It is just not as unified as it was under the Stamp Act. Now, all of this brooding, all of this tension, all of the continued boycotts, which are costing the British government a good bit of money, does lead eventually to armed conflict. Now, we're not to the war yet. Keep that in mind. The war is not going to start till we get to the end of this. But it does mean that the British government is going to respond to all of that increased defiance and what they perceive as, continuing disregard of their authority. And they are just, it is becoming by this point about far more than just collecting taxes. It is also about just asserting from the British perspective that they are in charge and that they can make laws for the colonies, and the colonies have to obey the law. They're starting to see this as, we're not to rebellion yet, but Britain kind of realizes, or at least feels, that that's where this could head if they don't do something about it, if they don't try to get all this in line. And so in response to all of the increased boycotts, to the just growing defiance of the colonies, in response to all of that, the British are going to start sending more troops to the colonies. Now, up until this point, they have mostly been along the frontier. Now this is where we start to see them sending more troops to colonial cities, but only in those where you were seeing lots of protests, particularly places like Boston. I mentioned that New England is where it becomes at this point sort of the epicenter of colonial protest. But if you had to single out a particular colony that was the most defiant, the most violent, even, and the ones that were always just right there on the edge and right there in the middle of things, it's definitely Massachusetts. But if you had to single out a single city that was the most defiant, that is kind of the epicenter of it all, where all the trouble always seems to start, it's most definitely Boston. Boston is always just the first in line to do something nuts, to or not even nuts, but just something radical, to take action. Always the first in line to break the king's peace, as it were. And that shouldn't be a surprise. Things like Boston Tea Party and about to see Boston Massacre and all that kind of stuff. It kind of becomes the cradle of the revolution. And think about it, that's where so much colonial trade was centered. And so they're being affected by a lot of this stuff more than anybody else. So coming back to this topic here. So in response to all of this, the Parliament is sending more and more troops to the colonies, particularly to Boston. And that, of course, angers colonists because now they've got to deal with these British troops there amongst them, walking the streets, trying to crack down on their smuggling, and they don't like that. It feels intrusive. It feels threatening. Also, the fact that, according to the English Bill of Rights, this is actually illegal. You couldn't have a standing army around during a time of peace. So some of the colonists will even go as far to say this is downright illegal. And so that's just increasing the tension, particularly in the Boston area, as they're starting to feel like they're under, military occupation. This, of course, is going to lead to an armed incident known as the Boston Massacre in December of 1770. Now, I find that this is often confused with the start of the Revolution. This is not the beginning of the war. We're still 5 years away from that. So this is an armed incident involving British forces, but we are not yet to the war breaking out. This happens when, you have troops down there in the town square in Boston, some rowdy colonists, probably half drunk, or at least some of them had a little bit too much, are upset. They don't like those troops being there. They see them as kind of a symbol of British oppression and all this stuff. And so these, handful of colonists go down to the town square and they start harassing these soldiers. This crowd kind of gathers around them and people are taunting them and they're saying ugly things and swearing at them. And it's one of those things, how like when you're in school and I know you've all seen fights and altercations in school. When people they hear this commotion, what happens? More people run over there. And then all of a sudden you got this big crowd watching. And that's exactly what happens here. And what happens in school? People start egging them on. People start encouraging them. People that don't even know what's going on are suddenly taken aside and cheering, and it just kind of gets really, really intense. That's exactly what happens here. So before you know it, you have this huge crowd of people. The soldiers are being surrounded by these people in the crowd who are screaming at them, who are getting more and more belligerent. And then it's also one of those things where, different people will tell you different things. It gets rather confused about exactly what happens. And different people would tell you a different story. But somewhere, people start throwing things, rocks, snowballs, different stuff gets thrown. And eventually, for some reason, these soldiers fire into the crowd. Colonists would argue that they were ordered to fire into the crowd. The soldiers would say they did it out of self-defense, or they felt like they were about to be, all those kind of things. But anyway, the soldiers fire into the crowd. 5 colonists are killed. So here we have a fight breaking out in the street, and these British troops killing 5 colonists there in the street of Boston. Now, you may be thinking, 5 people, that's not great at all. That's a terrible situation, probably quite tragic, but massacre is a bit of a heavy word for something like that. Well, that word was chosen by the colonists, and they had an agenda in doing that. And same thing with this image that you see here that you probably recognize. While the Boston Massacre definitely kind of, symbolizes how things were becoming quite tense in the colonies. It was shocking to a lot of people, and it was meant to be. It was definitely trumped up and used for its shock value. The Boston Massacre was definitely used by the colonists, particularly those more hot-headed, rebellious ones. It was used as propaganda. Propaganda, as you may well know, is, material that is maybe not embellished is a good word, exaggerated, or kind of presented in a biased way, maybe, not outright lies, but just meant to sell something, meant to sell a point of view, meant to persuade, meant to convince people of something, meant to present a certain image. And that's exactly what the colonists do with this whole incident. One, by calling it a massacre. They can put that out there to other colonies to say, look how terrible this is. Look how much of a threat the British government is. Look what they did to us. Keep in mind that the past several years, all of these protests and all of this stuff has been increasingly concentrated in New England. So a big challenge for those New England colonies is to convince colonies outside of New England that this is their problem too, that they should be worried too, that they should be supporting these revolution. And we're not to revolution yet, but these Sons of Liberty types in New England, because people in South Carolina kind of don't care at this point what's going on. Their view might be, that's you, not us. You got a problem with the king, but we don't, kind of a situation. But they're trying to spin this as this horrible act of ugly violence. Notice the picture here. This was drawn by Paul Revere. A lot of you probably know him. And you notice that it shows the British troops standing there up straight, organized. It looks like this guy here to the far right is actually ordering them to fire. And that's how they portray this, is that we were just standing there minding our own business and these troops just fired on us. Again, trying to send that message that this is everybody's problem and to get all the colonists on heightened alert about these things. And it does have that effect. It doesn't make people, just all of a sudden want to declare war or anything, but it is making some of those colonies outside of New England go, oh, that's not good. We don't want that to happen to us. It does increase that anti-British sentiment, which is exactly what the colonists wanted. The outbreak of violence here and the concern that this would lead to further violence and that this could lead to further acts of insurrection and things like that, it does lead Britain to repeal the Townshend Act. So they do get rid of those as well in the wake of the Boston Massacre. And after that, when the Townshend Acts are repealed in early 1771 or so, we have a period of things are pretty quiet for a while. It actually kind of goes back to quote unquote normal for a few years, and that we, don't see too much protest. Most everybody calms down. And that's exactly what the British government wanted. Let everybody calm down. And that's what we have. So things are pretty quiet in the colonies actually for a while. That is until 1773. 1773 is when we will see the colonies unite and everything flare right back up again. And we're right back to where we were almost overnight. And in fact, in a way that is more organized and more cohesive and more unified in the colonies amongst all 13 of them than we had seen since the Stamp Act thing. And that's the Tea Act of 1773 that does that. The Tea Act, I think, is probably the most misunderstood of all of these laws and things that happened because it sounds like a tax on tea. It's actually not a tax on tea because, I forgot to mention something very important. When the Townshend Acts were repealed, they repealed them all except for one. The one that they did not repeal was the tax on tea. So the tax on tea is actually still there, but the colonists didn't mind it too much because they just get around it. They smuggle like they've done for 100 years. Everything's fine. Well, that becomes harder after the Tea Act. That's why this changes things. So the Tea Act is not a tax on tea because that was actually already in place. That was part of the Townshend Acts that had been put in place several years before this. What the Tea Act was designed to do, it's actually designed to save a company called the British East India Trading Company. That was a trading company that by 1773 had been badly managed and it was in danger of going out of business. Well, Parliament didn't want that to happen because there were a lot of people actually in Parliament that had a financial interest in the British East India Company and did not want it to go under. So what the Tea Act did is it's meant to save that company from bankruptcy. It basically gives them a monopoly on the tea trade in the American colonies by exempting them from certain taxes, meaning they don't have to pay them. So it really does the opposite. It does not actually put taxes on tea. It actually removes some of them from the British East India Company. That way, what they're thinking is if British East India Company tea doesn't have taxes on it, the colonists will buy it. They will want that tea because it's cheaper. And then the colonists are happy because they get cheaper tea and the British East India Company doesn't go under. Everybody wins is what they're thinking. Well, Parliament must not be very insightful because they totally backfires on them, exactly like the Stamp Act kind of did. The colonists are outraged. They are outraged from Massachusetts all the way to Georgia, and just again uniting together in defiance in a way that they have not done since the Stamp Act, because the colonists saw this as kind of a trick. This is like a bribe, and it was, to get them to accept taxation without representation. Oh, you're trying to, hold this cheap tea over in front of our face and try to make us accept something that we do not agree with legally, that is just completely tricky, and that's just like you to do that kind of a thing. So they're very angry about it. And it also, what this does is it makes the tea, British East India Company tea, cheaper than the smuggled stuff. So you're putting smugglers out of business. And keep in mind that a lot of very wealthy and very powerful and very prosperous colonists are smugglers, and they're being put out of business by this. So they're not very happy about that at all. So their response, as I've already said, they see this as a bribe. They see it as a trick. They are outraged. They organize a boycott, a similar boycott, this time boycotting British East India Company tea, saying, no way, we are not even going to buy this stuff. We're not having it. And so for the next several weeks and months, this British East India Company tea is just stocking and piling up in colonial warehouses. The merchants won't stock it. They won't sell it. Eventually, it's just sitting in the harbors and in the docks because they won't even unload the stuff. They have no place to put it. And so the tension is just building and building, and everybody kind of waiting to see what will happen, and colonists refusing to use this tea. This, of course, leads to probably the most famous and the most well-known act of not just colonial protest, but probably one of the most famous acts of protest ever, the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. It was mainly it was an activity of the Sons of Liberty. The main organizer, or the chief organizer, was Samuel Adams. Some of you may recognize that name from the beer. He was a real person, cousin of John Adams, who later becomes a president, or second president. But Sam Adams was one of those particularly hot-headed members of the Sons of Liberty, but a very astute politician. These were not just crazy people that just wanted to run around and make trouble. I mean, they were smart individuals, and they were respected individuals in their particular colonies. But he organizes the Sons of Liberty to participate in this protest where, in the not too late in the evening, but at night, they dress up as Native Americans, as specifically as Mohawk Indians. They board the ships there in Boston Harbor and dump all of the tea, thousands of crates, thousands of dollars worth of British East India Company property, into Boston Harbor. Sometimes I think we get the image of this being like a secret and, very quiet sort of a thing. This was like a big old Boston pep rally. I mean, people came out from all over to watch and cheer them on. I mean, it was a big to-do. And a lot of people also don't realize that the Boston Tea Party, when you say that, you're referring to the one in Boston, but that it actually inspires other tea parties in other colonial cities. Over the next couple of weeks and months, lots of colonial cities have a tea party where they dump all the tea into the harbor and cause all this damage. Well, this whole thing to the British government is just incomprehensible, and they are horrified, disgusted, just completely, angry isn't the word. They just can't even believe that the colonists would have done such a thing, destroying property. It just confirms everything they've been saying for years about these colonists are just a bunch of wild backwoods, crazy people that have no business trying to govern themselves. And so they are pretty darn mad, I guess you could say, about this whole thing. So the British Parliament's next move is they're going to pass a series of laws. This is in direct response to the Boston Tea Party, called the Coercive Acts. Coercive coming from the word coercion, and coercion means to force, like to make somebody do something, to make them bend to your will. And that's the whole purpose of this. This is not a tax. This is not about raising revenue. This is not about trade regulation. The Coercive Acts are about punishment, and specifically aimed at Boston. This is not about, regulating trade in the empire. This is about punishing Boston for what they did, and punishing Boston for what has seemed like now a pretty, long pattern of defiance, and to make an example of Boston, and to teach Boston, and then to teach the other colonies to go we need to get in line. We need to do what Britain says. We don't need to do this anymore. So here's what the coercive acts did to accomplish that goal. They closed Boston Harbor. So they're shutting down Boston Harbor, nothing coming in, nothing coming out. And again, remember that Boston's economy, and therefore Massachusetts' economy, depended greatly on the commercial activities in Boston Harbor. So that is basically cutting off their air, cutting off their lifeline. That will have devastating effects throughout Boston by closing their harbor until they pay for the tea. So they've got to pay for all these damages that they have done. Their self-government is taken away. Their town meetings are banned. Their legislature cannot meet. They are basically like on lockdown until they behave themselves, until they sort of learn their lesson and agree that they will submit to British authority and do what they are told. Again, the purpose here was to single out Boston and to make other colonies go, oh, we don't want that to happen to us. We're going to listen and be good, and we're gonna be the good ones and not let that happen. But once again, it has the opposite effect. They completely misjudge that. The colonies, instead of trying to distance themselves from Boston and Massachusetts and trying to distance themselves from all of this, they more rush to Boston's side and agree that now the British government has gone way too far. This cannot be allowed. So the colonies are more united at this point. They're banding together at this point, and they're going to call these laws the Intolerable Acts. So Intolerable Acts and Coercive Acts is the same thing. Those are the exact same laws, but the colonists say this is intolerable, meaning they cannot take it. They say this is not fair. This is not right. We have to do something about this to not submit to authority. We're not about to submit to that because this is not something that any good government ought to be doing. So they denounce them, call them intolerable. And the colonies' next move is to meet. Again, we have another meeting of the colonies. Once again, we've seen this happen more and more as time has gone along. So in response to the coercive acts or the intolerable acts, not only did they denounce them and call them intolerable, but we will see the colonies calling for a meeting once again. This time we call it the First Continental Congress, which meets in Philadelphia in September of 1774. And this time 12 colonies participating. So if you notice, we've gone from 7 to 9 to now 12. So just one more to get on board. So we are really, really warming up and getting close to the colonies acting like one thing and behaving like a country. At the First Continental Congress, first of all, we need to understand that at this point, we are still not to revolution. Even with all this stuff, the majority, more than a majority of colonists, and certainly more than a majority of the leaders here at the First Continental Congress would not have been in favor of fighting. They are not about a revolution. They don't want to break away from Britain. They don't want to not be a part of the most powerful empire on earth. They certainly don't want to fight. As you can imagine, they probably would have seen that as completely foolish. What they want and what ultimately their goal is in all of this, and what they want to make clear in the First Continental Congress, is that their goal is reconciliation. Reconciliation means to reconcile. To reconcile means to make up, to patch things up. You get in a fight with a friend or someone, and then you talk about it and work it out. That's reconciliation. You have made up and moved forward. And ultimately, that's what the colonists want. They are pursuing reconciliation, and that is going to be their overall strategy for quite some time. So we are not yet to rebellion, we are not yet to fighting, and we are most certainly not to independence. It's not far, but at this point we are still pursuing reconciliation. The main way that the First Continental Congress is going to try to pursue that reconciliation is they're going to draft a document here at the First Continental Congress called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And that Declaration of Rights and Grievances is basically just a list of all the rights that the colonists think that they have, calling out things in the English Bill of Rights and stuff like that, and a list of grievances. Grievances is complaints, issues. They're saying these are all the reasons why we're mad. But the thing that they keep on stressing, and that they're sure to stress as much as they can over and over and over again, is loyalty. They are loyal British subjects. This is them saying, we love being British subjects. We love Parliament. We love the King. We got some issues. We got some stuff we want you to address. We have some complaints here, but we love you and we want to work this out. We want this to be better. And I'm sure you can probably think of, relationships, fights you've had with friends where you may have said something like that. It's like, look, I want to be your friend, but we gotta deal with this. And that's kind of what the colonists are doing here. So they send this off, and their plan is to pursue this reconciliation, send this off to the English King, to the Parliament, see what they say. But they agree that while they pursue reconciliation, they are also going to be preparing themselves for defense, at least in Massachusetts, where things are getting kind of ugly after those intolerable acts. But they also agree at the First Continental Congress that they're going to meet again come spring. So, spring of 1776, they're going to reevaluate the situation. So, they're recognizing now that this is an ongoing problem. This is not something they can just address one time. And they will come back if things have not gotten better by the spring of 1776 and meet again and see where they need to go next. And as we will see, things will not have gotten better by the spring of 1776. In fact, by that point, the fighting will have begun. So that's where we're going to conclude today, is by looking at the beginning of that fighting. So they send off that Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the Parliament, to the King, which will fall on deaf ears. The British government isn't going to ignore it the way that they will ignore multiple attempts at reconciliation by the colonists. In the meantime, particularly in Massachusetts, they are going to be preparing for possible defense because they are feeling pretty closed in and things are getting kind of ugly. Boston is pretty much occupied. So they realize that they may need to defend themselves. So over the next several weeks and months, particularly around the Boston area, they are gathering weapons. They are stockpiling ammunition. They are training their militia, all that sort of stuff, all of which is only causing the British government and the British military to move in even more harshly, because they look out in the afternoon and see colonists drilling and, practicing their shooting and all this stuff. They think they're about to have a rebellion on their hands, so they're moving in to try to disarm and stop that from happening, which is going to lead to the first outbreak of fighting in the American Revolution, which occurs April 19th, 1775, outside of two towns, Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts, which are both two towns on the outskirts of Boston. So it's no surprise that this is where it happens. This all happens when the purpose of the British forces getting on the move here, they were heading out to. They actually have orders to arrest some of those really hot-headed colonial political leaders, your Sam Adams, John Hancock, some of those that were like the ringleaders in this whole thing, because Britain really believes at this point that Boston is the problem. It's not all of the colonies that are trying to rebel, it's Boston. And even so, it's really just a handful of people in Boston. And if they can make an example of them, this whole thing will die away. So they have orders to go and arrest these colonial leaders like John Hancock and all of them. They can't find them. They don't know where they are. They've gone into hiding. They probably got tipped off that they were being looked for. So instead, the British soldiers decide to go after a stockpile of weapons. They know there's a stockpile of colonial weapons and arsenal in the town of Concord, Massachusetts. So British troops are heading toward Concord, Massachusetts in an attempt to disarm the colonists, get rid of those weapons so they can't fight them and can't have a rebellion. Well, at this point, the colonists get a warning. You probably have heard of the name Paul Revere. Paul Revere, he's actually one of a handful of, he gets all the credit, mainly because of Longfellow's poem, but there were a couple of other colonists that did the same thing that he did, just taking different routes and riding through the night, riding around the Boston area to all the other neighborhoods and towns, warning the colonial militias, your local volunteer fighting force, that the British troops were on the move and they were on their way. So because of the warnings of Paul Revere and a few other people, William Dawes and a few others, when the British soldiers arrive in Lexington, which was a town they have to go through to get to Concord, when they arrive there in Lexington, there's about 75 or so colonist militia there waiting on them in the town square in the green there. And this is another one of those instances in which colonists kind of accounted for it one way and the British soldiers said something completely different. But somewhere in there, shots are fired and a little scrap breaks out there at Lexington. Now, the colonists would say, we didn't do anything. They fired at us. We were complying with their demands and we were trying to leave and they shot at us. The British soldiers' account is different, saying that the colonists shot and then ran off and it was just kind of chaos. But their little scrap breaks out there in Lexington. Again, it was only about 75 or so colonists there. And so the little mess happens and then the British troops continue on to Concord. When they get to Concord, by that time, even more colonists have heard the call, grabbed their weapons, and when they get to Concord, now there's a couple hundred there waiting on them. So a second fight breaks out there in Concord, and the British forces retreat. Not because they were overwhelmed. They probably could have defeated all of them, but they didn't have orders to get into any kind of mess with the colonists. So they decide to retreat, having never found the weapons, and they start retreating back to Boston. On the way back to Boston, even more colonists are hiding behind the trees, behind the bushes, picking off British soldiers, and they actually suffer far more casualties in their march back to Boston than they did at Concord itself. But the significance of the fighting at Lexington and Concord, for the colonists would, of course, consider it a victory because they do force the British back to Boston, and they actually inflict a lot of casualties on them. But the overall significance of it is, of course, the fighting has begun. This is the beginning of the Revolution, the beginning of the war. No one really knows that yet. The colonists are hoping that this won't become a war at that point, but we, of course, know what this erupts into. So when the Second Continental Congress decides to meet, which they were actually planning to meet just a few weeks after this anyway, there will be plenty to talk about because the attempt at reconciliation has fallen on deaf ears from the British government. There's been no attempt to try to fix this problem, and now fighting has broken out. So that's what we'll look at next time, is what the next steps for the colonies were and how they continued the fighting, and how even at this point they weren't to wanting independence. So what was it that brought them to that point where they did want and did declare independence?